while we're waiting for more people to show up, you can look at this screen with your glasses, and the important thing is to keep looking until you get the phenomenon. What you should see is the image. You should see a face in your whole visual field, and then a house in your whole visual field, with no awareness of the other stimulus. But you have to keep looking for it to shift. And maybe if it doesn't shift, try blinking. Okay, yeah. How many are getting the phenomenon, which is, raise your hand if you can see it. The phenomenon is this. A face fills your whole visual field, then a house fills your whole visual field with no awareness of the face, and then again a face fills your whole visual field with no awareness of the house. So what is going into one eye becomes visible for your whole field, and then it becomes invisible. But you have to wait. You have to wait long enough for the shift to happen.
Bueno, pues vamos a empezar esta cuarta sesión de la Cátedra Gaos a cargo de NetBlog, que es un gusto tenerlo aquí. Y parece increíble, ¿no?, que se aporten tantos materiales, experimentos a tratar de resolver un problema filosófico, ¿no? I was telling that it is, at least for some of us, new that so many experiments
Yes.
in the discussion to solve a philosophical problem that seems to be something that we should analyze only.
Yes.
So, please.
Okay, so does everybody have glasses? Everybody has glasses. So let me just, this will come later in the talk, but I'd like to make sure everybody gets this phenomenon. So look at the screen, and you should have first a switch in your whole visual field from a face to a house, then a face. Come on, everybody has to do it. See, people aren't doing it. Well, okay. And it takes a little time And the explanation, well, I'll explain what's going on later. So how many people get the phenomenon? Okay, good. How many are not getting it? Because you don't have any glasses?
My right eye is very weak, so it's
Okay. Okay, yeah. Okay, so look, this is a continuation of Friday's talk. So I'm just going to briefly go over the material I went over Friday with emphasizing some things and de-emphasizing others. So remember, the issue is the contrast between consciousness and cognition. I'm going to just quickly go over the debate about sparse versus rich, and then I'll just quickly go over the quantifying sparse versus rich, Sperling, and then eventually I'll get on. Well, last time I did one methodological breakthrough. Today you're going to get two more methodological breakthroughs of different kinds, and that's where these glasses come in. And then I'm going to move to the distinction between unaccessed consciousness and inaccessible consciousness. The idea of inaccessible consciousness may seem a contradiction, but I'm going to argue that it isn't. Okay, so just to recall, the big debate is, in most people's point of view, is the debate between whether perception is sparse or perception is rich. I think that cognition is sparse, but perception is rich, and I think this shows that conscious perception must be in part distinct from cognition because it has a higher capacity, can hold more items. Remember, the evidence for rich was the Sperling experiment, where you get a grid, and people say they can see all or almost all the letters, but they can only report 3 or 4 of those letters. But if you have a tone, a high tone, medium tone, a low tone, indicating which row to report, you can report 3 or 4 from any given row. So we have what's called partial report superiority, which is that your overall capacity is 3.5 of each in each of 3 rows for a total capacity of 10.5. But in any one event, you can only report 3.5. So partial report superiority is with this queued partial report, you have 3 times the capacity of your cognition, where you can only cognize 3.5. Any questions about that before I go on? Is that all? Okay, everybody remembers that. And of course, we have a lot of people saying that they can see all or almost all. And then you may recall that so that experiment supports the idea that perception is richer than cognition. But then this kind of experiment supports the idea that perception is sparse, not richer than cognition. And here, I'll show you some different cases. So here there's a change. How many see what the change is? Raise your hand if you see what the change is. Okay, look up there. See the horizon goes up and down? Okay, but that's typical. It's a background thing that you feel is background. Here's another one. How many see? The shadow? It's always look for a change in something that most people will not attend to. That's the technique. Any question about this? Okay, so this is an attentional phenomenon. The things that change that you don't notice are things that you typically do not attend to, as shown by many experiments. But there are a number of different interpretations. The 2 ones that are most relevant is inattentional blindness. You do not see the features that change. And inattentional lack of access to the difference. You do see the features that changed, but you don't conceptualize those features at a level that will allow you to notice the change. So it's a difference between noticing and seeing. Any questions about that? Okay, so that is really the crucial distinction that I think much of the literature does not appreciate, because it involves the notion of non-conceptual content. The idea is according to me, you are seeing the things that change, but failing to conceptualize them so they don't get into your cognitive system. My opponents, failing to see the distinction clearly between conscious seeing and conceptualized seeing, think you are actually blind to the things that are changing. They think you do not see them at all. Okay? So if you get the distinction between conceptualized seeing and unconceptualized seeing, I think you may like the way I'm looking at it. So it's that, so really look, why is a philosopher doing all this stuff with experiments? It's really the distinction introduced by Gareth Evans between conceptual content and non-conceptual content that is at the heart, according to me anyway, of the dispute. It's a philosophical distinction that allows a view of what's going on in these experiments that is quite different from the one that is mainly accepted by psychologists and neuroscientists. So that's okay, there we go. Okay, but there is this other problem, this methodological problem, which is, so we can distinguish between the idea that the attentional bottleneck is before conscious perception, in which case perception is sparse, or the idea that the attentional bottleneck, it comes after conscious perception, so perception is rich. But the problem is, the cognition is the same, and since you never get any evidence without asking the subject, it seems like there would be no way to tell. But I am going to argue that there are these methodological breakthroughs that allow one to avoid what appears to be a paradox of getting evidence for something even though the cognition is the same. Okay, so in addition to the non-conceptual versus conceptual content, there is a kind of, another reason why philosophers should be interested in this kind of thing is that there is a methodological puzzle or paradox even, how one could show that conscious perception is richer than cognition, given that all you have to go on is people's reports which are based on their cognition. It seems like a contradiction, but I am going to argue that it's not a contradiction and that clever experiments manage to do it. Okay, so I'm now going to just briefly mention this quantification thing that I mentioned last time. Okay, so this is an experiment actually done in my wife's lab, Susan Carey's lab. And it's done two different ways. One way is you put pieces of graham cracker into a box, say 3 in one box and 2 in another box. You have a baby that sees the graham cracker and you look to see which one the baby crawls to. And the result is, if it's 3 versus 2, the baby reliably goes to the one with 3. But if you have 4 versus 3, the baby is at chance. The baby's cognition typically doesn't go higher than 3. You can do the experiment another way, and that's actually what's pictured here, which is you have boxes that have a kind of a rubbery top so that you can reach in, but you can't see in. And you do the same thing with the pieces of graham cracker. And then the baby can reach in and take out one thing at a time, because actually somebody's underneath putting the things in. So the baby can only get one at a time. And then you look to see how many times the baby reaches. And you get the same answer, which is that the baby reaches 3 versus 2, the baby will continue reaching in the one with 3. But if there's only 2, then the baby's seen 2, the baby will not continue reaching. Actually, it's a bit more complicated, but that's the rough description. So for babies, the span of cognition, working memory, is 3 items. For adult human beings, it's 4 items. For adult monkeys, it's 4 items. And for bees, it's roughly somewhere between 3 and 4. Now, just to emphasize, this is a a very, this description I'm giving is a crude description. It only, a better description is that there is a pool of resources that can be divided, but for these kinds of materials where there are large differences between each item, the limit is 3 or 4. So, but it depends on the materials. Okay, so then remember I went to the combination of Sperling and change blindness, where there was a, you have, see, I can't see the damn thing. Where is the, oh yeah, there it is. Okay, so you have 8 rectangles, and a pointer comes up, and then your job is to say whether the thing the pointer pointed to has changed orientation. And in this case, it's vertical here and horizontal here. Everybody get the idea? Okay, and then you look to see how many people can get right. And not surprisingly, if the pointer comes here, they get them all, or almost all. People will always make a few mistakes, no matter how easy it is. If it comes here, people get only about half, okay? About 4 of the 8. But if it comes in the middle, up to 1.5 seconds in this experiment, but up to as many as 4 seconds in some other experiments, the subject can still get more than 7, okay? So that suggests there's more capacity in the phenomenology of that image than can get into cognition, and that this is a marker of the capacity of cognition, and according to me, this shows that the capacity of the conscious system is greater than that of the cognitive access system. So it's a little bit of a different paradigm. Let's see now. I think I'm going to skip a little bit here. Okay, so on to rich unconscious, sparse conscious. Okay, so this is something I presented in an earlier lecture, but I'm just going to remind you how this works. This is called the attentional blink. How many remember this? Okay, I'll remind you. Here's how it works. You see a cross, and then you get a series of what are called distractors, those numbers. You're told, look for letters, okay? And then there can be 2 letters, like there's a K here and an H here. So if there's 1 letter, you see it fine with this kind of display. If there are 2 letters, and the second one comes shortly after the first, and this is the best, this is lag, so-called lag 2, with 2 distractors in between, then you have a hell of a time seeing the second one. That's called the attentional blink, and the reason is that your attention is used up by the first one, and I'm just going to remind you of how this works by showing you an example. Look for green words. Now, of course, you've all have seen this before, but many of you. Okay, how many saw 2 green words? And what was the first? Okay, the first was throw. What was the second? If you saw 2? What? Follow? I hear follow. How many follow? How many mention? Wait a minute. Keep your hands up for mention. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the result is, the second one was mention, and the result is people are very unlikely to see mention if they saw throw. That's the basic result. Okay. Now, my nemesis, Stanislas Dehaene, who doesn't believe in phenomenal consciousness, or at least doesn't think it's distinct from cognition, he did this experiment and did scanning with it. And here's what he says. He says, in a recent study of the attentional blink, we observed that up to about 180 milliseconds after stimulus presentation, the occipital temporal event-related potentials. This is activity in the occipital, that's back here, and the temporal cortex, which are generally considered to be the visual system, or at least the conscious visual system. evoked by an invisible word. So he uses the word invisible, okay? So that's like the mention, the second mention. He thinks that's invisible. I doubt whether it's invisible, but he says it's invisible. An invisible word were large and essentially indistinguishable from those evoked by a visible word. Yet on invisible trials, the participants' visibility ratings did not deviate from the lowest value used when no word was physically present. Thus, intense occipital temporal activation can be accompanied by a complete lack of conscious report. So that's the occipital temporal, and these arrows mean your attention is distracted from the stimulus. So here is his model. It's the global neuronal workspace model. And this is the most widely accepted model of consciousness among scientists. So let me explain the model. It's a little bizarre, but here's the way it works. This is meant to be an abstract representation of processing in the brain. The outer circle is supposed to be the sensory periphery of the body, your eyes, your ears, your skin. And the dots are processors. So it's a kind of abstract idea that you have processors in your brain. The dark dots are activated processors. The light dots are less activated or inactivated processors. And then the dark lines are activated connections between processors. So the idea is, this is the sensory apparatus in the back of your head, okay? Conveniently, the brain is arranged to make it very easy to talk about sensation or perception versus cognition. Because perception is in the back of the head, cognition is largely in the front and the middle, mainly the front, okay? Very convenient arrangement for the theorist. So, and this is the back of the head, and this stuff in the center is your thought process in the global neuronal workspace. Pardon me. Okay, so here is the idea of this model. The model is that perceptual mechanisms are suppliers of representations. The consumers are these mechanisms in central cognition of perceptual categorization, memory, reasoning, reporting, evaluating, deciding. And there is this phenomenon known as broadcasting in the global workspace. What is that? Okay, so you have an activated sensory, something in your perceptual sensory areas, a big activation. Now, sometimes those big activations can fail to mobilize. They fail to recruit other activations which mutually reinforce them. But if they do mobilize strongly enough, they can trigger a big activation in the global workspace in your thought that mutually reinforce each other. This is called ignition in his terminology. And then that's broadcasting in the global workspace. And it depends on competition among this coalition, that coalition, this one. They compete and only one or two can win, and the ones that win create ignition and they link up with the global workspace. And once it's in the global workspace, items can be used without further amplification. So here is a brain picture, and this is the back of the head, this is the front of the head. This is a clear case of conscious perception that he agrees is conscious perception. And what you get is, you have these arrows mean you're attending to the stimulus. You're attending to the arrows pointing to the back of the head mean you are attending to the stimulus. You have loops here, and then big loops going all the way around. And what makes it conscious, according to him, is the activity in the front that feeds back to the back. Okay, so that's conscious perception according to, and everybody would agree that's conscious perception. Here is subliminal perception. You're attending, that's what those arrows mean, but no loops here. You get small activations in the back of the head, in your sensory areas, and they can lead to changes in your performance, but it's subliminal perception and not something that you can talk about, report, or use in decision making. Now we get to the disputed category. This is what he calls preconscious. So the title of this lecture is Conscious, Preconscious, Unconscious, okay? So this is the disputed category where he thinks preconscious, according to him, is a kind of unconscious. And it's the case of the attentional blink. You have the loops in the back of the head, and the subjects give low visibility ratings or 0 visibility ratings. His way of describing, you may have noticed, was a little tricky. He didn't say 0, he said indistinguishable from when there was no target. It's a little bit, so it's a, anyway, he says that's unconscious. I say it's probably conscious. So here's the question though. You could, if in that attentional blink, if the first one wasn't there, if throw wasn't there, you would have easily seen mention. And you would have attended to it, and that's why you would see it. So the question is, does the act of moving attention to that stimulus enable access to a pre-existing conscious phenomenology, or on the contrary, does it, as DeHaan thinks, promote an unconscious representation into consciousness? So that's the big question. So, and it's the question that that is behind this dispute about where the attentional bottleneck is. And one nice thing about his model is it shows what the cause of the attentional bottleneck is, namely a very small number of coalitions in the back of the head can trigger ignition. So we have an account of why there's a bottleneck, but now we have to decide. Yeah?
Could you just say, please, a little bit more about the distinction between subliminal and preconscious, and not at a neural level, but at an intuitive level? How are we?
Yeah. Okay, so at an intuitive level, subliminal perception, which would be indicated by these things. These are what, they're activations that don't do anything, that don't cause ignition. Okay, so those, from a first-person point of view, those are complete darkness, okay? From a first-person point of view, there's no consciousness of there's no perceptual consciousness. That is a pure unconscious perception. It can have effects later, but they're all completely unconscious. I think DeHaan would say the same thing. But what about the pre-conscious case? That's this case. Let me go to this one. What about this? What is it like to have this? This, according to me, is the paradigm of unconceptualized consciousness. There's something it's like, but you don't report because in order to report something, you have to apply concepts to it. Now, the reason you don't apply concepts to it is because your attention is distracted by something else. So on my model, it takes attention to apply concepts. Without that attention, you don't apply the concepts, and so it doesn't get into your cognitive system. So that's supposed to be the idea, that what it's like to have this is conscious perception, probably not as vivid as the full-blown consciousness, and the reason for that is that these feedback loops actually do something to your consciousness in the back of the head. Without the feedback loops, it's not as strong. It maybe differs in its content somewhat, but still, according to me, that's conscious perception without conceptualization. And I'm going to show you later some actual experiments that very strongly suggest that. Okay, I showed you one, but there's the other two are actually extremely interesting. Okay, so let's see. So where am I? Okay, so now I'm going to just sort of briefly go over some ground from last time about what my opponents say is in consciousness. I'll skip the fragment illusion and just talk about the generic illusion. So in these experiments, what they say is in consciousness is representations of letters at a place, but it's just, instead of this shape, that shape, that shape, it's letter, 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 okay? And they think that what's doing the work is the unconscious representations of letters. And here is their view of the other experiment I showed you. Here it's, what's in consciousness is a representation of non-square rectangles at a certain position, but the orientation is not specified. Only in unconsciousness is the orientation specified. So just to elaborate the models a little bit, the real dispute here is between this model and this model. So the Amsterdam group and I think that conscious perception is rich and the attentional bottleneck comes before cognition. The opposition really thinks this, that unconscious perception is rich, conscious perception is sparse because the attentional bottleneck comes here. De Haan advocates this model, but I think if elaborated, he would really go to this model. So I think the real, I've been talking as if the dispute is between this and this, but it's really between this and this. Okay, so the problem, as I've been saying, is that if there's more information in conscious perception than our cognitive system can access, then how can we know about it in the first place? It seems that what the subject says will be the same in all the scenarios. So here comes the three methodological breakthroughs. And as I said last time and again today, the two, I think, ideas here are that consciously conceptualizing the stimulus requires attention and global broadcasting. Non-conceptual conscious percepts do not require global broadcasting. And the first technique, which I've already shown you, but I'll just briefly go over again, is that cognition is the same, but only the same with respect to the specific details. It doesn't cover ensemble properties, okay? So just to remind you, this experiment, of which Hiller Jacobson, a philosopher, is one of the experimenters, you get a cue. This is different from Sperling. You get a cue first. You get this big array of different colors. The colors can be chosen from a small group or a large group. So the issue is color diversity. Then there's a blank interval. And then you get a square, which you're supposed to answer what letter was in that square. So that's an index of how many of the letters you recall. And the square can come in a cued row, like the top row is a cued row, or it can come in any row. The square can be anywhere, right? Everybody get that? And then you have to say what the color diversity, in some cases of the cued row, in some cases of the uncued row. Okay, so again, just to remind you, low versus high diversity, and the diversity could be in the cued or uncued rows. Oh yes, the letter task is the main task. You get feedback. The diversity is characterized as a low-grade, unimportant thing. Don't worry about it. No feedback on it. So the subjects are really trying very hard to get the letters right. Okay, so the main response. This is non-cued rows, and this is cued rows. So the main result is that non-cued rows are not very different from cued rows. The blue is the case where the cued and non-cued are the same in diversity. The red is they're different. So you have to compare blue with blue or red with red. But in both cases, they are very similar, not much of a difference between them. Blue is more accurate than red, but the reason for that is it's easier to get diversity if it's the same throughout the display. Importantly, whether the diversity judgment is about cued or uncued rows, the number of letters they get, that's roughly a little over 3, is the same. It's not costing them any working memory to get the letters right. The letters, they max out on the letters whether they're talking about queued or unqueued rows. Oh, gee, so let's see. Yes, okay, so the result is they get the diversity in the unqueued rows, suggesting they are seeing the specific details of at least two colors. Okay, so this argues that, but of course we have to ask the question of whether they saw those things unconsciously. Maybe that's unconscious perception, and there were three ways they have of addressing that. One was they had an escape button if you didn't see colors, and people were very accurate in if the letters had no colors, pressing the escape button, but they never used it for the unqueued rows. The second thing is they did a special task with a very short presentation compared to this presentation, and then these masks that make the thing hard to see. That's just a well-known technique for making something invisible. And then what they found was that the diversity estimation, so this is the visibility ranking, the lowest, the middle, and the highest, and this is accuracy, this is chance. At the lowest visibility, they were at chance. At the highest visibility, they got a very good score of, I can't quite read what that is, like 80%. So the idea is that the diversity judgments are based on conscious perception. Now, interestingly, they could do average perception in subliminal stimuli. So that's an interesting comparison, that there are obviously two kinds of gists or ensemble properties here. And then, I won't go into this, they did a simulation which suggested the same thing. Anyway, the conclusion is there's probably conscious awareness of specific items in unattended rows, suggesting rich conscious perception. You know, at least two items, maybe more, to get a good diversity judgment. And the methodological improvement is use these ensemble judgments. They seem to get into the global workspace independently of specific details. So any questions about that? This is, many of you, this is the second time you've heard it. Sorry, for those of you who are hearing it for the first time, I'm sorry if I went through it too quickly. Okay, so that's methodological breakthrough 1. And the breakthrough is ensemble judgments. You can exploit ensemble judgments. Here is technique number 2. And this is where your red and green glasses are going to come in. Okay, so this is a study done by Wolfgang Einhauser's lab, and it involves this stimulus, which I guess all of you have already seen. Maybe some people came in late, didn't? So the idea is this exploits a phenomenon, so keep looking at it, especially those of you who haven't looked before. This exploits a phenomenon known as binocular rivalry. And the phenomenon, very useful phenomenon in the study of conscious perception. So how many have not tried this? In the back, have you tried it? Okay, so are you getting the effect of first one image fills your whole visual field, then a second image fills your whole visual field? If you do nothing, you just wait? Okay. You may have to wait a long time, so you might try blinking. Okay, so it's called binocular rivalry. And here's the interesting thing. It's a constant stimulus with a shifting percept. That's what's so cool about it. So you can look in the brain and you can see the stimuli are the same. It's just the stimulus on the screen is not changing. What's changing is in your brain. Okay, so, and this was Nancy Kanwisher's lab at MIT were the first to discover this, that you could very nicely separate an area called the fusiform face area. This is the brain from underneath. It's at the bottom of your temporal lobe, at the bottom of your brain. And most people have it on the left. I have it on the right for some bizarre reason. And there's been a lot of work done on this area since Nancy Kanwisher discovered it. And then there's some other areas that are less specialized, but she calls the parahippocampal place areas. So the idea is when you're seeing the face, your fusiform face area lights up, and there's some other face areas. There's two other face areas too. Okay, so now this is a cool thing for looking at the, yes?
Just tiny question. If it's not a phase, but say another object, like
Yeah.
it doesn't work like that.
No. Faces are one of the few stimuli that have a very specific identified circuit with an area, right? For many types of stimuli, there's no area that anybody's discovered that lights up. But for faces, it's really these three areas. It's really quite cool. But that's because we're so specialized for faces. Okay, so now here's the interesting thing. When people did this experiment, so you might think, now we can find the neural basis of consciousness because your consciousness is shifting and the stimulus isn't shifting, so you just look in the brain and see what changes, right? Now, interestingly, what happened is when people have done this, they get results that support Dahan, my opponent. So naturally, I was not pleased to see this. So here are results of 5 different studies. It's all, so this is, according to me, the neural basis of consciousness is in this part of the brain. But what they're getting is much higher results in frontal and parietal cortex. And so this led to the idea that what's going on in consciousness is really cognition. And this was taken as a big support for when these studies came out, and they're, in the late 90s and early 2000s, apparently supporting the idea that what is going on in consciousness is activation of the global workspace, which is frontal and parietal. However, there's one little tiny problem with with all these experiments, which is in all these experiments, the subjects are reporting whether they're seeing a face or the house. That's the relevant measure. Okay, how do you know whether the subjects see anything? You look at their reports. So this little problem is that this methodology doesn't seem to distinguish the neural basis of reporting consciousness from the neural basis of consciousness itself. But how could you possibly get a handle on consciousness itself without reports? Okay, so the problem here is that both reported and unreported percepts involve visual areas in the back of the head. So here's what this guy Einhauser did. Very clever experiment, which is he noticed, let me just, before I do this, let me just explain. So you saw a face in a house. Okay, but another thing you can do is you can use moving stimuli. And one interesting kind of moving stimulus is one where in one eye it's moving one way with green background, and the other eye it's moving the other way with a red background. And then it will be just like the face in the house. You'll see green moving left, and then that'll go away, and you'll see red moving right, okay? And here's what he discovered. He discovered that actually there's an eye movement indicator of what you're seeing, okay? And then he was able to discover, using reports, of course, that that eye movement indicator was extremely powerful. So here's what he did. He did a binocular Raver experiment, and he didn't ask for a report. The subjects are just sitting there not doing anything, okay? They're looking at the screen because it's in front of them, but they're not reporting. They have no task. And what he found is that the major differences in conscious perception were in the visual and spatial areas in the back of the head. And here's what his summary is. Importantly, when observers passively experienced rivalry without reporting perceptual alternations, a different picture emerged. Differential neural activity in frontal areas was absent, whereas activation in occipital and parietal regions persisted. We conclude that frontal areas are associated with active report and introspection rather than consciousness. So we can see that the frontal activations that were found earlier were the frontal activations were the basis of reports rather than the consciousness itself. Oops, I forgot that. Okay, so the methodological improvement here is don't ask for reports. Of course, you have to validate the method with reports, And there's some interesting little wrinkles about the validation of the method that show that it is actually quite accurate. In some ways, it does better than reports, but I won't go into that. Okay, so here's technique number 3, which is you ask for reports later. So it turns out, and this could work in binocular rivalry too, except that there's so many alternations that it'd be hard to know what to report. People can have a memory of something they saw that they don't report, and you can look at the neural activations involved in that. And this uses a technique called event-related potential. It's a form of EEG. You have this coil, these wires on your head, and this method, of course, has been used by DeHaan's group, and these are from one of DeHaan's papers. So what he finds, so this is his conscious and this is his preconscious. And here's what he finds. So this technology is a bit weak on spatial, that is distinguishing one area from another, but it's very strong on temporal discrimination. So everything here is in the timing, okay? So along this axis, we have a number of milliseconds from the stimulus, and in this axis we have the amplitude of the effect. So this is DeHaan's graph, and what he shows is red is seen and blue is what he calls non-seen. In other words, the person didn't report it. Better, if you ask me, would be reported, red reported, and blue not reported, okay? So what he finds is the big difference in reporting of stimuli is associated with ERP effects that come after about 270 milliseconds. That's the key dividing point, in his view, between conscious and unconscious perception. The big dividing point is in its conscious perception, it's 270 milliseconds. However, again, it's the same problem we saw in the Einhauser thing, which is he's not distinguishing between reported consciousness and consciousness that's not reported. So he's not distinguishing the contribution made when you have to see something and decide what you saw, conceptualize what you saw, decide what button to press and press it. So the methodological breakthrough comes from some work by a guy named Michael Pitts. And here's what Michael Pitts did. It's actually a very cool experiment. I'm only going to report a tiny bit of one experiment, okay? The other experiments do a number of different things, but it's all roughly the same idea. So the basic idea is you have 2 tasks. One that is the main task, and that's, in this case, it's this. It's you see a circle with dots, and then, actually now I'm forgetting a little bit whether one of them dims or one of them increases. I can't remember which it is, but one of these dots either gets dimmer or increases. I don't remember which, but it's something to do with the dots, so your attention is focused around the edge. Then, in the background, you see these constantly shifting lines. And I don't know if you can tell, but some of the lines, in some of them, form a figure. In this one, it's a square. One of them, it's a diamond. I can't see it from here. Is there a diamond there? Okay, so these figures can form in the background. So the simplest version of the experiment is this. You have 240 trials where you have to report the dimming or brightening of the dots. And then after 240 trials, you give the subjects a questionnaire intended to tell whether they saw one of the figures, like a square, okay? And then here's the amazing thing. If you look at the activations for the people who were aware of a lot of the squares, what you find is the correlation is not with what DeHaan says. The correlation is not here, it's here, before 270 milliseconds. It's what correlates with conscious perception when you are not reporting it is not global broadcasting. It's something that happens before global broadcasting. And here is his summary. This is actually a summary from a somewhat different experiment, but anyway, this is what he says. In agreement with our previous inattentional blindness results, that's the one that I just showed you, stimuli that were consciously perceived yet not immediately accessed for report. Okay, so I'm sorry, I should have explained. Okay, so what he did in the second study that he's actually summarizing here is he contrasted 4 different conditions. One where the subject was aware of a certain stimulus versus when they weren't aware of it. And then also whether it was task relevant or task irrelevant. The idea is that the task relevant were ones they reported it, the task irrelevant was where they didn't report it. Anyway, he says that stimuli that were consciously perceived yet not immediately accessed for report elicited a mumbo-jumbo, but the important thing here, I don't say the mumbo-jumbo, the important thing is the timing. So negativity, positivity really is very unimportant for understanding this. The main thing is what correlated with the awareness, whether you reported it or not, or sorry, when you didn't report it, is between 200 and 240 milliseconds, while stimuli that were accessed for report elicited additional components, including mumbo-jumbo later, subsequent to the mumbo-jumbo earlier. Overall, these results suggest that some of the NCC's neural correlates of consciousness identified in previous studies may be more closely linked with accessing and maintaining perceptual information for reporting purposes than with encoding the conscious percept itself. And of course, what he's talking about, the early words of this earlier previous studies is things like the Dahan stuff that I showed you. And what he's talking about is, what he's saying here is, some of the results reported earlier, like the one I just showed you here, really are confusing reported consciousness with consciousness itself. So I'm really pleased by this, and the methodological improvement is don't ask for reports until later. Okay, so here are the 3 techniques. Technique 1, the Israeli group, Usher and Hilla Jacobson, ensemble judgments seem to get into the global workspace without interfering with specific information. Technique 2, eye movements can indicate what the subject is consciousness of. The method can be calibrated in uncontroversial cases and applied to controversial cases. And technique 3 is ask for reports later. So those are the three methodological breakthroughs. And I draw your attention to Dahan's book on consciousness in the brain, which came out last year. Yeah? 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 Yeah.
Is there a difference between left-handed subjects against right-handed subjects or a tendency?
Gosh, I have no idea. It's not reported in the paper. What? Who? I can't see who's talking. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there shouldn't be? Oh, okay. Yeah? Yeah? What?
It's recruiting specific areas for attention, and that those are not related to whether you are left-handed or right-handed.
Yes?
I think it should be related to eye dominance.
To what? Eye dominance, yeah. Well, as somebody mentioned, the binocular rivalry can fail to work if you have one eye that's too dominant or one eye that's too undominant. Yeah.
Yes, I was questioning this because this slide says the method can be calibrated for uncontroversial cases, controversial cases. I think it was the researchers were thinking about this high dominance.
Uh-huh. Okay, so I'm afraid I don't know the answer to this. I've had a lot of correspondence with Einhauser. I'll ask him. Look, I doubt that if there is some conflation with handedness or dominance that they would have just missed it, because it's a very prestigious group, his Einhauser group. So I think they know what they're doing, but I simply don't know about this. Okay. We should have a microphone for people who are talking. I know somebody has that microphone, but I don't know where it is. Okay, anyway, to just say what the upshot here is, DeHaan in his book makes a big case for his point of view. This book came out last year. And by the way, despite my disagreements with him, I think it's an excellent book, probably the best up-to-date book on the entire science of consciousness, modulo this little problem about not distinguishing between unconceptualized and conceptualized consciousness. Anyway, what he says is, when the prefrontal cortex does not gain access to a message, it cannot be broadly shared and therefore remains unconscious. And I think he's simply conflating conceptualized consciousness with consciousness. He thinks if it's unconceptualized, it's unconscious. So that's my critique of him. So here's just a summary. The evidence comes from these, well, I already went through this. Okay, now I don't have much time left, but I just want to say a couple of things about the distinction between unaccessed and inaccessible consciousness. So far I have not claimed anything about inaccessible consciousness. I gave experiments like Sperling where necessarily most Sperling items are unaccessed. It doesn't follow that any Sperling items are inaccessible. It's like lottery tickets, necessarily most lose. It does not follow that there's any one of them that can't win. Okay, so this distinction between necessarily unaccessed and inaccessible is a very important one. So far, I'm not claiming any inaccessibility, although I'll say a little bit about that in a minute. Okay, now I just want to move to a paper that came out in Trends in Cognitive Sciences by Dan Dennett and Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen's a psychologist, and Dan Dennett is a philosopher everybody knows. So they describe what they call the perfect experiment. They say, they have a little dialogue. Experimenter, you are conscious. So here's what they imagine. They imagine that you take a subject, you identify the color areas of the brain, and then you prevent those color areas you cut them off so that those color areas have no access to frontal lobes and no access to your thought processes. Okay, so you have a subject who, as far as he is concerned, cannot see color. From the first person, he thinks he cannot see color. So the experimenter says, you are conscious of the redness of the apple. The patient says, I am. I don't see any color. It just looks gray. Why do you think I'm consciously experiencing red? Experimenter, because we can detect recurrent, that's feedback loops, processing in color areas in your visual cortex. Patient, but I really don't see any color. I see the apple, but nothing colored. Yet you still insist that I'm conscious of the color red. Experimenter, yes, because local recurrency correlates with conscious awareness. Patient, doesn't it mean something that I'm telling you I'm not experiencing red at all? Doesn't that suggest local recurrency itself isn't sufficient for conscious awareness? And then they say, if this perfect experiment could not definitively disprove dissociative theory, so my theory is what they call a dissociative theory because I'm distinguishing between conscious perception and reportability. So then they say, the subject manifests all the functional criteria for not being conscious of color, so what would ground the claim that the subject nevertheless enjoys a special kind of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, without access consciousness? Those are my terms. They're criticizing me there. And just to remind you what that really is about, let's see if I can find I never found my way back. Where is it? Yeah, so they're talking about this case because here the subject says he doesn't see anything, and I'm saying, regardless of what the subject says, he is seeing something. But notice this is not inaccessible, because if he attended to the stimulus, he would see it. Yeah, so this is the attentional blink. If the subject's attention had been different, he would have reported it, okay? And by the way, what really happens in this is the subjects aren't sure. You know, this is one of these things where the thing comes very quickly, and the subjects give it a low visibility rating, but if you ask somebody for confidence, you typically don't get very huge. But anyway, that's not relevant. I'm saying that the subject reports he doesn't see anything, yet I'm claiming that he does see something consciously. So, you know, this is some, you know, so there we're criticizing a real thing. Then they say, is this criticism avoided by saying that the hallmark of purely phenomenal states is their being accessible but not actually accessed? In this number 8, wherever that is, where is the number 8? That's a reference to a paper of mine. And then they say, why consider accessible yet not accessed states as being conscious rather than simply the product of unconscious processing? As the dialogue above illustrates, such an experience is one that you cannot attend to, base decisions on, remember, or report about. Cannot attend to, base decisions, well, what? Cannot attend to? No. You can attend to the items, you just don't. Right, like the Sperling case in the unqueued rows, or the Amsterdam groups in the items that are not queued, or in the Israeli group experiments, the rows that are not queued. It's not that you can't attend to them, as they wrongly say. It's that you don't attend to them because you're following the instructions of the experimenter. If you did attend, you would consciously see and report them. So I think they got that a little wrong. Now they say, it does indeed seem to people that there is more in consciousness than they are accessing at any one time. I think they're right about that. And we know that because they tell us, but the simple act of saying, but it seems like I see more, is itself the product of accessing that information in some attenuated form. Yes, that's right, but that's generic or ensemble information. The issue is specific information. The specific letters, or anyway, the shapes of the letters, the specific orientations. As I've explained, everybody now realizes that even without attention, you get generic information like that it is an array of letters or a circle of rectangles. What reason is there to think such information is conscious before it's accessed? So we can all agree that generic access to the letters, the issue is whether we have consciousness of the specific details. Still, I think that they're right, that there is, the issue of why consider the accessible yet not accessed states as being conscious rather than pre-conscious, as DeHaan says. That's the real issue. So I claim that the 3 methodological breakthroughs I've just mentioned speak to that. I think they strongly suggest that things that are accessible yet not accessed really are conscious, but still there is a remaining kind of discomfort here. How could it be my conscious state if I don't know about it? I mean, you might say first-person knowledge is of the essence to consciousness. How could consciousness be so divorced from reasons and rationality? And then you might argue that this is consciousness in some merely attenuated sense of the term, not the real sense of the term that we normally mean. Okay, so in the remainder of this talk, and I'm going to go 10 minutes over, I'm afraid, I'm going to try to respond to this. And my response is going to be to show you some neuropsychological syndromes in which you can get an impression of what it might be like from the first person to have a conscious state that you cannot access, or at least cannot easily access, or at least cannot access now. Okay, so I'm trying to get rid of I'm trying to combat this idea of how could it be my conscious state if I don't know about it. I'm going to try to show you that it is possible to have a conscious state you don't know about, or at least it's intelligible, okay? Now, I want a warning. You are about to see very weak evidence. This is not at the level of the previous experiments. And the reason is, this is, as is the case in neuropsychology, where you're looking at patients, you're dealing with single cases. Every one of them is different from every other one, and it can be very difficult to get any real experimental evidence of the kind. The cases I've shown you before, they're all psychophysics. You can have just, like the Pitts experiment, thousands of trials, okay? And you can really get very good data from that kind of thing. The data here just, look, I sympathize with the experimenters. They're struggling with a very difficult situation where they've got a patient and they're trying to figure out what's going on with the patient. Okay, so now we get to inaccessible consciousness. Oh gosh, sorry, is this going to be on the movie? Actually, I do have permission for this one. So this is, okay, so what we're going to look at is, this is a video of a patient. Let me see if the sound is working. Yes, good. Okay, so what we're going to be looking at is a phenomenon called anosognosia, which is the inability to report a deficit, a neurally caused deficit. These patients typically have strokes. Something goes wrong, and then very often, or sometimes anyway, they seem to have some what I would describe as a cognitive blockage. They cannot admit to themselves that they can't do certain thing or certain thing isn't happening. Now, there are many different varieties of this kind of phenomenon. Some of them are cases of hallucinations. I'm picking one where, if anybody wants to ask, I can try to answer why it's very unlikely in these cases that there's anything hallucinatory or anything like that. These seem to be pure cases of blockage, and I'm going to be relying heavily on the work of Katerina Fotopoulou, who is a neuropsychologist at University College London, and that is her right here, and this is a patient, and this patient has given permission to use this video. Okay, so sorry, I didn't say. This patient is totally paralyzed on the left, okay? This patient cannot move her left arm or left leg at all, but this patient does not know that she cannot move her arm or leg at all. Now, I have another video where the guy tries to move his arm and then says he's moved it. But this is a better video. So she doesn't actually do that. And one thing I like about this video is this is a smart lady, she's trying to cope, but she's making stuff up. Okay, so Katerina is going to ask her various questions about can she move her left arm, and she's going to do what can only be described as kind of evasiveness. So here we go. Oh, damn. Here we don't go. Where is it? Okay, I hope this works. Oh, why isn't it not going?
And do you think you have improved at all?
Yes, I do.
Good.
Can
In
you hear
what
it?
sense? What do you think is better lately?
I think I'm a bit more overall confident that I shall get quite a bit better.
Good. In terms of your arms,
Yes,
are you any better in your movement?
yes, both of them are a bit better.
Both arms are a bit better. And legs?
Well, one is still not at all good.
Which one?
Left one.
The left one is not at all. Does it move at all?
Well, not totally reliable.
Not reliable. And the left arm, is that reliable?
Left arm. Well, I more or less sorted that out now, I think.
I more or less sorted that out, the
One
left
arm.
arm.
Try touching my hand with your left arm. Excellent. Which arm is this one?
It's your right,
And yours? Which hand is this one?
my right, at the moment.
At the moment. Can you touch it with the left hand? Touch my hand with your left hand. Okay. Let's relax this one. Relax this one. Let it relax down. Touch my hand with your left hand, please. Okay. Is that your left hand?
No, at the moment it's my right.
Okay. Is it because the left hand cannot do the task? Or because you don't want to?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure.
I thought I'd try with the right first and get the position sorted.
Okay, so let's keep that here. can you use your right hand, sorry, your left hand to touch both arguments? Now that you know the position, you're going to try. Did you do it? Well done. Ask you some more questions about movement, okay? Regarding your left arm, if I asked you to move it towards, let's say, the table, before you do it, on a scale 0 to 10, how well would you say you will be able to do it? 0 is not at all. 10.
5 to 6.
5 to 6, you will be able to reach the table with your left arm.
5 to 8.
Can you try that to see? Oops, difficult? Okay, so how would you say from 0 to 10 again, how well have you done this?
I haven't yet.
You haven't yet.
I will.
It's difficult. Let me ask you again, if I were to ask you now, after we've done this task, how well can you use your left arm to touch this table? As usual, as well as before your stroke, which is 10, or not at all, which is 0. Where would you rate yourself?
4.
Okay, so I don't know how much of you, it's in a hospital, there's a lot of noise. I don't know how much of that you could, how many people could hear everything? Okay, good. So she thinks she can do it, right? Or she thinks she can do it fairly well. At first she says 5 to something is her ability to touch something with her left hand, then she goes down to 4. So she does. Now, I have this other video, which in some ways is better. Let's see if did I put it in here? Yeah, okay, so I'm going to do the other video as well, but I'm going to turn off the sound because they have subtitles. It may be easier. So this guy seems very depressed, more depressed than that lady. Now the key thing comes when he says he can do it, but then he says he's doing it or done it. Okay, now he's trying. He's trying to move his left arm. Okay, so that's the key thing, that he thinks he's just done it. So here we can ask this, here's a way of answering this. Here's the issue. Did these people have consciousness of the visual and kinesthetic experience as of paralysis as they happened? They didn't report it. They don't report trying to move their hand and failing. Now, the blockage could be at the level of just report. It could be at the level of the narrative about the self. It could be at the level of global broadcasting. At least in these two cases, there is a possibility here of conscious experience without knowledge of it, without clear cognitive access. Now, there's a number of ways of getting information about this. One of the things you can do is you can do these experiments, and Tony Marcel has done with these cases, where you ask questions like, how well can you open a beer bottle, row a boat, or tie your shoes? Questions about activities that need two hands, versus if I was in the state you are in, how well would I be able to do these things that require two hands? And interestingly, you get a much higher rating for them than you do for how well I would do, suggesting it is some kind of a cognitive inability to appreciate the deficit. Here's another one. How strong is this, the good arm? How strong is this, the bad arm? and they give equal responses. However, if you say, is this arm, the good arm, ever naughty, as compared with, is this the bad arm ever naughty? They say, about the good arm, and on the bad arm they say, sometimes 25%, yes, and I'm thinking of punishing it. So this is confabulation, which just is a technical term for making up stories. So look, it could be controlled by non-conscious states or conscious but unaccessed or even inaccessible states. And Fotopoulou has tried to do some experiments. They're I'll just say what one of the things that she's done. So here's one. Fill in the missing word with a word that is completely unrelated to the theme of the sentence. For example, a hoist is often used to lift paralyzed patients off the blank. So the result is that these anasygnosic paralyzed patients were slower than other paralyzed patients, suggesting that the mere mention of paralysis even though creates some kind of cognitive difficulty even though they claim they're not paralyzed. Implicit knowledge of paralysis. Now, it could be conscious, it could be unaccessed, it could be inaccessible. It's a little hard to know. What Fotopoulou says about this is that she says, for example, one patient with anosognosia for paralysis on one side, that's called hemiplegia, who she described unceasingly complained about everyday difficulties with an emotional intensity that better fitted her devastating disability than these minor everyday disappointments. So Fotopoulou thinks this is some kind of the emotion from the thing that's really problematic is being put off on some other things, suggesting some kind of Freudian or some other kind of psychodynamic phenomenon. And here is another form of evidence, which is the debriefing after recovery. So here's the thing. These anosognosia cases, it's what is called an acute syndrome. People have a stroke, then the thing lasts a couple months, and then afterwards, people don't seem to have the anosognosia, even if they have the paralysis. So here is the same lady. We're seeing her later when the acute phase is mainly gone. And here's what she says. Look, you'll see at 1:16, so I don't know if you'll be able to see the times, she will say, I could see that it wasn't really moving. So she remembers later that her arm wasn't really moving, or so she says.
Yesterday, we had a great breakthrough, didn't we? Huh? Tell me about it. What did you learn?
I was more realistic.
You were more realistic about what?
My left side not being able to do it.
Not being able to do anything. Okay, and how do you feel about that now?
It's sad, but it's all right.
It's sad, but it's all right. Okay. You also told me something about the sense of control. Do you remember what you told me about the sense of control?
Yes, it was difficult feeling I'd lost control of everything.
Uh-huh. But how do you feel now?
I think you said that I could learn to have some control, but in a different way.
Okay. Does it make any sense? I'm glad you remember all this. Okay. Now, if I were to ask you, during this time, as you said, you weren't so realistic, what did you believe about your arm?
It might have moved, or I might be able to move it.
Mm-hmm. And you genuinely believe that? Yeah. Huh? Did you have any emotions? How did it feel, your arm? Were you afraid of anything?
It was frustrating. I could see it wasn't really moving.
I could see
it wasn't really moving, huh? So what made you say that it was moving?
I was hoping, perhaps.
You were hoping, perhaps. Huh? So when we were asking you before, does it move? And sometimes you were saying yes, or you were saying, I think it will move. Sorry. Was it because you were hoping?
You are going now.
Is that it?
Well, now.
Or was it because you were feeling your arm might move? Did it give you any sense? It was just hoping. It was not that it gave you some sensation.
Yeah, another picture.
I'm not asking to trick.
Okay, well, it's hard to know what to make of what the patient says, but look, here's the thing. It might be conscious experience without knowledge of it, without clear cognitive access. So the idea of this, from a philosophical point of view, what's really important here is that it's intelligible, that a person could have a conscious experience that they don't know and maybe can't know about. So that's the point of these things. It's intelligible. You can imagine a story. In fact, you can see a real story that might be that, of someone who has a conscious experience without knowledge of it, without clear cognitive access to it, at least at the moment. So that's the idea. So my opponents like Dennett and Cohen, who try to give these thought experiments showing it's unintelligible that somebody might have a conscious experience that they don't know about, they're just not considering mechanisms that they're considering a silly mechanism, right? Because if you really, if you claim something was a neural correlate of consciousness, and then it didn't correlate with consciousness, as far as you could tell, you would have to reconsider. Okay, so anyway, just to say my conclusion is about this stuff, that it's very weak evidence that this patient experienced the paralysis but could not allow herself or himself to cognitively appreciate it. And conclusion 2 is that conclusion 1 provides strong evidence for the intelligibility of the possibility of conscious experience without clear cognitive access or even accessibility. So that's the use I'm making. So what's my overall conclusions here? Consciousness without cognitive access or even accessibility makes sense. There's some evidence for conscious percepts without actual cognitive access. I don't say there's evidence for conscious percepts without the possibility of cognitive access. There's some evidence that consciousness is rich and cognition is sparse. It's possible to decide between these apparently indiscriminable hypotheses. And just to remind you of the 3 breakthroughs, you see them up there on the left. And the important point is that non-conceptual conscious representation does not require global broadcasting. We have evidence for rich conscious perception from gist judgments, delayed answers, and indicators of conscious states from eye movements. And that's the end. I'm sorry for going over the time.
Hello again. I have a 3-part, 2 comments and 1 question. The first comment is about the difference between confabulation and making something up. I believe that we have to be very specific that confabulation, it is making something up, but the difference between one and another is that in confabulation, the person is not deliberately doing it.
Yeah, okay, right. I'm sorry. You're right. I shouldn't have said it's just the same as making it up. You're right.
Okay, so, because that's even a more strong component of the argument.
Yeah.
The second comment, I just forgot. But the question is, could it be possible that we're looking at like this elephant in different sections, like this experiments you showed us first, the Han, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing correctly, is like describing some aspects of this phenomenon, like the ears of the elephant, and then Dennett is describing the tail, and you're describing the legs, and if we can put this together, I believe your position, if we put ourselves in your argument, we're able to put all of this together and talk about consciousness as a very comprehensive phenomenon.
Yes, I agree with that, except that I think that DeHaan and Dennett are talking about the same thing, and I'm talking about a different thing. Okay. They're talking about conceptualized consciousness, where you not only have a conscious state, but you conceptualize it and have the ability to report it or do report it. Whereas I'm talking about unconceptualized consciousness, non-conceptual conscious content. So I'm talking about what Gareth Evans was talking about, and the idea is, so Gareth Evans made the point in his dispute with McDowell that we can appreciate finer-grained sounds and colors than we can form concepts of. Now, I think there are some problems with that example because he's really talking about concepts that persist, whereas I'm talking about concepts of the moment. But we're saying similar things. I'm saying that in your ordinary experience, your experience is far too rich for you to be able to conceptualize all of it. So you're inevitably going to have some unconceptualized conscious content. And the thing is, I think where what I'm talking about goes beyond what Evans was talking about is we can quantify this now because we have a measure of how well you can do in applying concepts. And the answer is the stuff about working memory, what that shows is you can really only apply roughly 4 concepts at once. Whereas what's in your your consciousness is way more than 4 items.
Okay. I just remember the last comment that it's interesting how these patients with anosognosia have the part of the brain that processes emotional information, the amygdala, the central amygdala, is playing a different role when they're not able to report and when they are able to report. So maybe we're looking at a process that incorporates other information like emotional information.
I don't think we know that the amygdala is playing a different role in those 2 cases. It could be that the amygdala is being activated just the same, but what makes you say the amygdala is playing a different role?
Some scientific evidence. Also in these other cases of it's a condition where you cannot prosopagnosia, is that how you say? You cannot recognize faces, where the fusiform area is not working correctly. There's also an influence of the amygdala before and after. So that's what
You're talking about implicit face recognition?
I believe so, yeah. I'm not sure.
Okay, so yeah, maybe you could send me some relevant references to that.
Yeah, sure.
I wonder if the case of tip of the tongue phenomenon, which is very normal, everybody has experienced that, would shed some light in this distinction that you are making. There is a group of Spaniard neurophysiologists that elicit experimentally tip of the tongue phenomenon by showing people photographs of celebrities. And sooner or later, everybody comes to a face that they recognize, but they are not able to name. And they start doing all of these things that we do, to be able to remember that. And they study the neurophysiology behind the process of not knowing the name, recognizing the person, being able to talk a lot about the person. This is the same actor that was in this and that movie and so on. And then eventually, especially if they are not consciously trying to remember, eventually they do remember the name and what happens then. And essentially what happens is that there are parts of the brain active when you recognize the person but are not able to name it. And then when you name it, you connect parts of the frontal lobe and so on. So, it seems that in your terminology, how to interpret this experiment. You are phenomenologically conscious that you are remembering and knowing who a person is, but you don't access the name. So you have partial access to maybe iconic memory. but you don't have access to the name. And then when you do, you have another type of phenomenological consciousness. I don't know, again, all of my questions to you have been in the same sense. There is not a sharp distinction between access and phenomenology here. In both cases, they are both at play in different ways. I wonder if you comment to that.
So the question that I would raise about the case, first of all, I should say I'd be a great subject for this experiment because
you have a lot of
they could elicit that phenomenon in me in about 1 second. So what I would say about this is there are two possibilities. The name may be unconsciously represented before you've accessed it. It may be consciously represented before you've accessed it. And we have to do experiments to try to find out which. You know, it could be some kind of intermediate case, maybe, which is what you think. Maybe it's a little bit conscious, but somehow not enough to report or something. Maybe, you know, I don't deny the possibility of intermediate cases of both access and phenomenal consciousness. I think maybe you know, I'm not one of these people who say that consciousness is like a light bulb, it's either on or it's off. I think that there are probably in the phylogenetic scale borderline cases, and I think maybe in us there are borderline cases. Look, if you believe in a neural basis of consciousness, you're going to believe there are got to be intermediate cases or undecidable cases, or, you know, so I'm on board with that. I just don't know that this is one of them.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so if I understood you correctly, you take the second version of the house face example, the one with the eyes only, as supporting your view rather than your opponent's, because it's clearly the case that there is no conceptualization because there is no report, right? But can't your opponent say, well, we're not sure that there is no conceptualization involved just because there is no explicit report. Maybe the person only can see the face and the house because she is conceptualizing in her brain, even if she's not reporting.
Yes, but the lack of differential frontal activation suggests the person isn't conceptualizing the two things. So the result really, I think, counts against that idea. Yeah.
Can I? Well, Ned, here. Now, I just was wondering whether you have a situation in which you have two descriptions, two right descriptions, and I don't know whether experiments can show whether there is a right description.
Because what description?
A right description.
A right one, yeah.
Correct, a right one. Because, well, you are saying there is conscious already, even if we don't report, and the other says, well, yes, there are some mental states with some phenomenology, but it doesn't amount to consciousness. So it seems to me that it could be something conventional to say where consciousness happens. And so both descriptions could be right. It depends on the terminology that we decide to use. So the question is, are we in front of a real problem or a question of decision, which terminology we choose? And that's it.
Yeah. Okay, so I think your question reflects your view that there is no such thing as phenomenal consciousness, because if you believe in it, as I do, you believe it's just not a matter of terminology. If you are having those phenomenal experiences, that's a real fact in the world. So I'm a realist. So the world of consciousness the theorists of consciousness divide into realists and maybe fictionalists. So my colleague Hartree Field has asked me the question you've asked me repeatedly. He thinks it's a terminological question. He maybe doesn't have any first-person experience, I don't know. And Dennett says things like that too. And you know, it's always been a puzzle to me. I have so little sympathy with that point of view that I have trouble coming to grips with it. And there's a famous, so look, according to me, and my intuitions about it is, gosh, how could there be anything more factual than that I am having conscious experiences now versus a case where, that I see, that I see this, conscious experience of that, versus not. It's not a matter of the words I'm using. Okay, don't let me use the word conscious experience. Okay, so I'll say, there's something it's like. When I do that, there's something it's like. Of course, there's all terminology. But the thing is, to me, it doesn't seem a matter of terminology. I mean, I admit, as I said to Luis, that there can be borderline cases of indeterminacy. I'm not concerned with saying it's always one way or the other very clearly, but I just don't see a terminological issue here. Now, the most famous, or maybe one of the most famous, maybe the most famous psychologist of the second half of the 20th century was this guy, Roger Shepard. He's still alive, I think. He did amazing things. Some of the first imagery experiments. So I once had a discussion with him about this issue, the issue that intuitions seem to differ so much on this, and he thought maybe it's an issue of how good your imagery is. If you have to form it. I don't know. Nobody's ever investigated this as far as I know, but I know people do have very different intuitions about consciousness. So let me give you an example. So in 1995, I wrote a paper in which I made the distinction between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. Where phenomenal consciousness is what I've been talking about, the what its likeness of experience, and access consciousness is something cognitive. Reportability, availability, accessibility, that kind of thing. And I got 2 anonymous reviews. One of them said, I don't know who wrote them, one of them said, okay, I understand why phenomenal consciousness is something you'd call consciousness, but would you call this so-called access consciousness really a kind of consciousness? Another one said the opposite. Access consciousness, now that I can understand as a kind of consciousness. This phenomenal consciousness, why would you call that consciousness? And so, somehow terminology is all very tied into your viewpoints on the subject matter. It's a very puzzling thing. I don't really get a grip on it.
But it seems to me that you are denying the possibility that there could be mental states with phenomenology that they are not conscious. And I would like to know why you don't accept this possibility.
Okay, I do accept the possibility, but the states with phenomenology that are not conscious fail to be conscious in the access sense. So for me, phenomenal states that are, if you want to call a phenomenal state unconscious, it's like the Freudian unconscious. What does a Freudian mean? So Freudians have these mechanisms. There are 2 different mechanisms. They use, I forget the words for them, suppression, and I can't remember the words, but one of them it's pulling down from above, and the other one is pulling down from below and pushing from above. Anyway, these are mechanisms that push something into what he calls the unconscious. But that unconscious, from a Freudian point of view, is inaccessibility. If I have the belief, if I have the desire to murder my father and marry my mother, but I can't admit it to myself, and so it's unconscious in the Freudian sense, that means I can't access it. It says nothing about the phenomenology. As far as the Freudian idea is concerned, it could be had phenomenology. So that's inaccessibility in the it's unconsciousness in the access sense. It's just a separate issue of whether it's phenomenally conscious or not. So I can make sense of the idea of phenomenally conscious yet unconscious in the access sense.
But you would deny that it makes sense to talk about phenomenology without consciousness.
No, I don't deny that.
Not without access. No, but you are saying, yes, in such cases we have phenomenological consciousness, but not access consciousness.
Yeah.
Now, why you tie so strongly consciousness and phenomenology?
I don't.
Why you don't accept the possibility to feel something without being conscious, period? I mean,
Okay. So that genuinely is a question of terminology. So, I'm happy, but I'm very flexible in terminology. I'm happy to use the word consciousness for both phenomenal consciousness and for access consciousness. How could something be phenomenal yet not phenomenally conscious? That to me is a terminological issue. By phenomenal, I just mean phenomenally conscious.
Yeah, so I have one comment and two questions, if I'm allowed for reasons of time. So I will try to be very quick. If not, someone stop me. The first one is regard to your third methodological breakout, and just something that I think Dennett would say if you show him this result, and he would probably deny post-presentational reports, saying something that, oh, it's all unconscious process and then it's bring into consciousness. This is the reply that he gave. So what he used to say about dreams, for instance. So when you're waking up, so people just take this unconscious processing and reporting. And this is a general problem for all post-presentational paradigms. Do you want to say something? Or
Yeah, let me say something. So look, I follow you in the question of dreams. I don't agree with it in the question of dreams, but nonetheless, I think that kind of response is on far better footing for dreams than it is for these cases. These cases, you ask the Pitts had a detailed questionnaire about, did you see any squares? How sure are you saw those squares? And all kinds of stuff. The subjects are telling you they saw squares even while they were doing the task. So why doubt that?
Yeah. So, well, the second question is what I asked you before. So, what it is likeness aside, what are the marks of the? I'm just using the terminology of the Han, but so between the preconscious and the subliminal. So let's use the conscious, phenomenal consciousness correspond to what he calls preconscious, and then we have the unconscious, which is the subliminal. And what it is likeness aside, the marks of these two phenomena? How are we to distinguish them empirically? I mean, not after having a theory of look here, there are loops. So we need loops. Are there any marks that would distinguish that?
You mean, are there differences in behavior?
Okay, can you say?
Well, the only differences in behavior are ones that can be gotten via the three methodological breakthroughs. So, in the case of binocular rivalry, the person isn't doing any reporting, but the eye movements are telling you he's consciously seeing a face. In the Pitts cases, the person isn't reporting the square at the time, but he can tell you later that he saw the square. In the Israeli study, the Usher study, we think the colors in the uncued rows are consciously seen because the subjects are able to report diversity, so they must be seeing at least two colors, and then he has three tests to see whether it's conscious. So those tests would argue that it's conscious rather than subliminal.
And finally, okay, I think it's not. I will wait till the end. If it's time, I will ask.
Then I also have a couple of questions, so that's why I was bothering Sebastián. The first one may be just a clarificatory question, because I couldn't follow perfectly some of your arguments, but it seemed that at a certain time you were inferring from we haven't accessed some generic information to we having been conscious before that of specific information from which we...
Wait a minute, let me get this. So we have not accessed generic, so I moved from We didn't access generic information we didn't access specific information?
No, we did access generic
We did
information.
access generic.
Therefore, we had conscious specific.
I didn't, no, where do you think I argue that?
Well, yeah, in the contrast thing and the color contrast. It seemed to me that you were...
Which color contrast?
The experiment in where people had to report whether they saw the diversity, color diversity.
Okay.
Diversity, that was, okay.
Yeah, so let me get that. This is the Israeli study. So here, yeah, oh, sorry, that's not it, this one. Okay.
It seems at a certain moment you were saying that the fact that we had, that we could access this color diversity was evidence that we were conscious of something more specific. For example,
I did not argue that.
Okay.
They had 3 tests of consciousness.
Okay.
I agree that you could access the generic information unconsciously, and in fact, their tests suggest that average color in the uncued rows could be accessed unconsciously. So let me just move to the three tests to remind you. Oops. Mm-hmm. The 3 tests are the catch trials, this one of where they actually gave estimates of visibility, mm-hmm. and when they could get the diversity judgments when the things were visible and not otherwise, and the third was the simulation. So I agree that diversity can be done unconscious. Sorry.
Yes.
I agree that ensemble properties, at least in one sense of the term, can be accessed unconsciously, and average color is an example.
Yes.
But they had tests to suggest that, 3 tests to suggest that diversity isn't one of those.
Okay, so diversity is something that we access, right?
Yeah.
So then where is the evidence that we have a more basic and more specific thing that we actually consciously perceived, but we didn't access? What is the evidence here for that?
Good. Okay, so the reasoning is, in order to judge diversity, you have to have seen more than one color.
Why?
Because
I don't see that. I'm sorry. I think that we could have just perceived the contrast. I don't see why we should have inferred it from having perceived different colors.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't see why you are ruling out this possibility.
Because you have to have seen 2 colors and also have some appreciation of how far apart those colors are.
Why?
How else could you judge color diversity?
Because you saw that just the content of your perception, of your conscious, accessible perception, was that there was high contrast in the image. Mm-hmm. I don't see why this is not a
It's not a matter of contrast. No, contrast is a perceivable property.
Exactly.
But the thing is, diversity.
Whether
diversity isn't a
something.
perceivable property. Difference might be a perceivable property. I don't know of any evidence that diversity is a perceivable property.
But why wouldn't it be? It seems, at least prima facie, it seems to me similar to contrast. It's something that you perceive the difference. So you perceive a sharp difference between the color of something and the color of something else without needing to see the color of those 2 things. You can just see those differences, and from that, it seems to me that it's possible, at least in principle, that what you saw was just.
Let me back up a minute.
Okay.
It isn't really. I mean, my case is stronger if what I said is true. Mm-hmm. But I still have a pretty good case, even if what I said isn't true, for the following reason. The question is, even if it was average color and you needed whatever they're doing, they are seeing something about the uncued rows consciously. Those 3 tests prove that they are seeing something about the uncued rows consciously, and that's really the issue. Is do they have conscious perception of properties of the uncued rows? And this experiment argues they do have conscious perception of the uncued rows, and that it comes for free on top of the 3 letters that they could get. It didn't matter whether the diversity was of the uncued rows or the cued rows. They were still able to get 3 letters. So that suggests that there is more in consciousness than gets into the global workspace, because they could perceive this property of the uncued rows. So my case is stronger if they actually saw 2 items.
Yes.
But even if it was average, an average of it, that would still show something over and above the contents of the global workspace relative to the uncued rows.
Yeah, you're right, I think. Thank you.
Just a couple of notes regarding Axel's questions. It's minor stuff. I was wondering if, like in the other test, they tried to make it, and I don't remember the term, but it was something like it had the same luminescence, so contrast was not an issue. The same luminescence, like it was a technical term, I don't fully remember it, but they could make it so they have the same relative contrast while still having different colors, so they could test, they can rule out that possibility. It's something you could do.
I mean, if the colors are isoluminant.
Exactly, that was the term.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know whether they were isoluminant. That's a good point.
That will rule out Axel's objections.
Yeah. So his point is right. That is, we know contrast is a perceivable property, but if they made the colors so that they all have the same, contrast is just a luminance difference. We know that you can perceive contrast. It's a basic property of the visual system, but if they made the colors isoluminant, so there was no issue of contrast, maybe they did. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. Then there would be no issue of contrast perception. It would have to be based on colors.
Yeah, also there was like one of the first catch tests was they could press the escape key if they didn't perceive any color.
Yeah.
So that will also rule out Axel's objections. If they didn't perceive any color, just the contrast, they would have pressed the escape key.
They may not really know the difference. I mean, that would be a difficult judgment for a subject to make.
Guess so.
Yeah, I mean, they pressed the button when they saw white with no color. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture, Professor. It was very clear to me.
Raise your hand, I don't see you.
Here.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
Well, I want to ask you about your methodological principle. It's like, why do you think that a complete explanation about consciousness just involves inner brain activity and does not involve also the relation of the subject with his environment?
Yeah. Okay, so that is an issue that I have not covered at all in this, and I won't unless by popular demand we're going to talk about externalism about consciousness. So perhaps you have in mind the inactive approach. Yeah. Okay. Look. I've written a review of Noe's book, and I've been in a debate with Kevin O'Regan. These are both published about that approach. And I actually have a talk on that topic, which I could give if there's a popular demand, but it would be it's just too much to start to get into now. But yeah, I don't look. I don't. What can I say in a short? I can't really get into it.
Well, but if you can resume it in, say that it's for empirical evidence that you have this intuition, it is just...
It's not an intuition. I think that the scientific evidence very strongly counts against so-called externalism about consciousness, but I can't really start in on that now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have a question about the reasons for making the distinction between cognitive access and phenomenology depend on concepts. I mean, it might well be that the difference between the content we have cognitive access to and the content we are phenomenally conscious of is a difference in conceptualization, but I fail to see why this is the reason. So the level of explanation, I would put it in as a matter of the cognitive architecture we have. So why? Because it makes room for this distinction in other areas, like for instance in cognitive phenomenology. So if there is such a thing as phenomenally conscious thoughts we lack cognitive access to, those would be constituted by concepts. And then we cannot capture the distinction between cognitive access and phenomenology in terms of concepts. And we can do this if the distinction is made as a matter of architecture, like different buffers and different processes. And it might well be that in the case of sensory perception, it is accompanied by conceptualization. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Yeah, so I'm only talking about perception, but I think that it might be a very different situation for cognitive phenomenology, as you say. It may, look, I'm willing to admit, even for perception, that conceptualization makes a phenomenal difference. And it may be that in the case of cognition, you need concepts to have that. So I agree. And maybe I'm happy to accept the idea that in cognition, you need concepts to get cognitive phenomenology. In fact, so you've told me this before, and I keep kind of, in thinking about this, I'm really just thinking about perception, and I'm kind of cognition to one side, really. So, but you may be right. Thank you.